Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. I've done over 120 shows now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to Mark Hearld. Mark is an artist and designer who has a fascination with flora and fauna and has worked in a range of different media, including lithographic and linocut prints, paintings, ceramics, textiles and tapestry. However, he's best known for his collage pieces. A graduate of Glasgow School of Art and the Royal College of Art, he's curated installations and exhibitions at York Art Gallery in Compton, Verney, and is an avid collector of objects. Over the years, he's been a huge advocate for the importance of mid-20th century British artists such as Edward Bawden and Ravillious, and the role of craft in the fine art world. Mark has a major show at the Scottish Gallery opening next year, and another edition of his book, Raucous Invention, The Joy of Making, will also be published by Thames and Hudson. Mark, thank you very, very much for doing this. How are you?
I'm really well. Thanks so much. Yeah, great.
Good.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you. Was that reasonably accurate?
That was really accurate. Yeah.
Very accurate. Good.
Yeah, very good.
Thanks very much.
I feel well represented.
Well, that's good to know. I'm keen to know where you are right now.
Well, I have to own up to being pretty technically challenged. In fact, I don't even have a computer.
Wow.
I use Instagram and I do everything through my mobile phone. I used to have a MacBook, but the screen cracked about 5 years ago and I've never really updated it. And yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. Probably a little bit reactionary, but I am in safe hands because I've come to my friend's Alex Malcolmson, who is a creative collaborator who I make woodwork things with.
Right.
And he also has sold my work over the years. And his daughter is helping us with the technicalities of this podcast.
Very good.
So it feels quite fun that I'm actually recording it, not from my own studio, but from a studio that I know really well and where I've worked with another artist.
In that case, Mark, we're going to cheat because we have a bit of a tradition on this podcast of asking people to describe their studios to help really locate their work and them for the listener. So could you tell us a little bit about your studio and how you work?
Well, I have a shared studio and it took me quite a long time to realize how important for me going and working in a place where other people were working would be. I did have a period of about 3 years where I worked on my own and I found it a struggle. I'd literally have to go to a cafe every lunchtime just to get a dose of interaction. And I think I worked out that the difference between extroverts and introverts comes down to this. You're either topped up by interaction or introspection. So the fact of being in a shared studio means that there's lots of interaction and that helps free you from yourself enough in order to focus on the movement of hands and creativity. Whereas I think sometimes if you're in splendid isolation, you might get distracted by your own head or your own mood. Whereas I feel if you're in a space where there's a feeling of productivity, you can then get on with the job in hand.
But presumably there's a point where people are distracting for you.
I think there is a point, and I think it's a fine line. But somehow I managed to navigate that line well, and it feels on the most part that people around and about in my studio are not distracting, but stimulating.
Okay.
And also I do have a sort of room off the main room, although I irritate them by working on the communal table quite a lot because I'm quite sociable and I like to be in the main where it's all happening. But my actual space is actually full of heaps of paper of all types and materials, some of which I found, some of which I've bought in a kind of grand, really fine paper, other bits of paper that might have, I don't know, wrapped a sandwich that I've picked up, but they've got a beautiful checkerboard on them that might come in later. There's Florentine end papers. There's modern British end papers printed from the Kerwin studio. There's the main kind of paper that I have are what I call paste papers. And those are papers that I've made myself using colour, often acrylic, mixed with a flour and water paste. And you paint out this paste onto a paper. And because of the starch in the flour and water paste, it means that it dries really slowly. So any pattern or mark or scratch holds in the paint, and you can create wonderful textured surfaces which lend themselves really, really well as an ingredient for collage.
Interesting. It's
a process that was originated by bookbinders who would use up leftover paste and add colour to it. So on sort of French manuscripts and bits and pieces from the 18th century, you'll often get these really, really very physical, tactile-looking little books, and they've been covered with this paper where you can see the evidence of somebody's thumbprint and finger spiral to create a decorative pattern.
Swirling around in it.
Swirling around.
Interesting.
So that approach was a real eye-opener. You know, it led to a whole other means of expression. And this papermaker called Victoria Hall showed me that process on a workshop, and I've never looked back since then.
Very good. Well, we'll get into your collage work in a minute, but before we do, the last time we talked, which was a couple of months ago, I was writing a profile of you for the Art Society magazine, and your dog, Brio, had just had puppies. How have you all been, I wonder? I mean, it's literally days, I think, we spoke, and there were lots of puppies running around your house, and you were kind of fathering them.
Well, I think I hear people talking about long COVID and having a COVID brain. I've got a puppy brain at the moment. Just last week, the final puppy who was leaving went at 13 weeks, but I've kept one of the pups called Damsel, a maiden of noble birth. And that whole process of having these dogs has been absolutely enriching and magical and completely distracting, but also inspiring in a way. So it has been crowd control, having to circumnavigate a puppy pen to go between the cooker and the sink in my kitchen, and also for a time trying to make work at home for my show at Tinsmiths. But now they've all gone off and I'm just left with one pup and Brio, the mother. And hopefully I'm going to get back into some more focused creativity now.
When we spoke, you just finished his residency at Dovecot Studios, the tapestry workshop in Edinburgh.
Yes.
I'm quite keen to talk about that to begin with. How did that come about?
Well, I love tapestry, and I've sort of realized for a long time, I sort of looked to tapestry for inspiration for collage, because something to do with the formalization of tapestry is similar to the formalization that I sort of deal with when I'm making collages. There's less of an emphasis on recessional space in tapestries. It's to do with the side-by-side placement of graphic elements.
Right.
And that sort of language, that visual language, is a very good go-to inspiration for the collage maker. So I'd always looked at tapestries. I followed the Dovecot studio, and I've been interested in people like Bawden and Archie Brennan and lots of people that have actually made these wonderful tapestries, and I admire them. And also I exhibit up at the Scottish Gallery, and Christina Jansen, the director there, has close links with Celia Joycey, the director at Dovecot. And I said I'd love to do a tapestry. And the two power women got together and made it happen. I say that out of reverence for them both, actually. I was there for 3 weeks and they set it up beautifully. So Christina found me somewhere to stay, an inspiring flat with Dennis Peploe paintings on the wall. And Brio was allowed to come. And I walked from Newington through the meadows to the Dovecot, and then just worked a sort of 9:30 till 6 every day on these cartoons for tapestries.
Right. Looking at your career, and we've alluded to this in the way that your studio is set up, I guess, but you do seem to enjoy collaboration. I mean, you've worked with potters and created fabrics and wallpapers with the likes of St. Jude's. illustrated books, so collaborating, I guess, in a slightly different way with writers. You've curated exhibitions and installations, as we said in the intro, at York Art Gallery, Compton, Verney. I mean, it's obviously something you thrive on.
I really do. And I think the older I get, the more that I realise that's vital for keeping creative. I feel passionate as well about when you work with another person that you credit your co-collaborator. You lose nothing by doing that, and everything's to gain. And I feel it's so enriching to work with somebody who has a different skill set to you, and that the two of you can be more than the sum of your parts when you go work together. I'm sociable. I'm interested in all the other discipline, sort of interdisciplinary approaches and all the, the other fields such as pottery or letterpress or working with woodwork. So when you collaborate, you can contribute to a different kind of making process, which is really fun, I think.
So when you arrive at Dovecot, did you have a sense of what you were going to make and how you were going to make it?
I sort of did. The brief that I'd set myself was being inspired by 16th century verdure tapestries. And those are the tapestries that tend to feature foliage and creatures. And I love the collection of tapestries at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. There's also an amazing plaster frieze there, polychrome plaster frieze. And something about that inspired me. There's these particular verdure tapestries that have wonderful acanthus leaves and perching birds in the stairwell that are just so inspiring. And I'd read a book by Helen Wilde about tapestries within the National Trust collection. And she is also up in Scotland, head of textiles at the Scottish National Galleries. So basically, I had this historic line of inquiry. Also, the best tapestries in Britain used to be at Hardwick. They're called the Devonshire Hunt tapestries, but they're now in the V&A.
V&A, yeah.
And I've got one of those really grand 1960s books that's in my bathroom. And I pick it up and look at a perching hawk on somebody's gauntlet or a dog. I'm not really interested in the kind of the ferocity of the hunt, but I'm really interested in the formalization of the creatures and the millefleur, the garments, the color. So there's a romance in tapestry. So I had all of that lined up. But at the same time, I see myself as a sort of modern British maker. So there's also Matisse and his large paper cut cartoons for things, sitting on the other show. So I sort of wanted to think about both of those inspirations and come in and work at quite an architectural scale to make some big pieces that would furnish a room, that would actually change the atmosphere of a room. Because I think that's another wonderful thing about tapestry is they affect a space. So they create an atmosphere in a space in the way that maybe a painting or an image behind glass can't actually do. So all of that was exciting to me. And then put me in a giant former swimming baths, Victorian swimming baths in Scotland. Yeah. And I just made this big work, much to the sort of, not disappointment, but the Dovecot team really wanted me to work small because they like to actually interpret the image by blowing it up, because it makes the translation from collage or image to tapestry more effective. But I think they saw that I was having so much fun working at the same scale that they allowed me to go ahead with that.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because artists can be quite particular about how their work is treated. I mean, is it a curious sensation giving away control with the finished pieces? What tapestry artists are going to do isn't an exact reproduction. It's an interpretation, isn't it?
No, I could see how that could be problematic for somebody. This is where you step back slightly, but you sort of engage in a different game, which is the sort of collaborative game. And I feel like I'm really fascinated by the way that the interpretation will happen. And as far as I understand it, I'm going to be quite involved. So I left the Dovecot team with this fun, abstract collage of fragments and bits and pieces, offcuts. And I think Sophie, who's the apprentice at Dovecot, is going to make an attempt at weaving this abstract fragment sampler. And then I'm going to go up and then we're going to talk about colour choices. So I will be drawn in and I will have a voice to say, well, we could do this like this, or, you know, so I will have an input, but at the same time, I'm working with master crafts people whose absolute métier is working with colour and texture. And that feels an entirely enriching, exciting prospect, not a daunting one in any way.
I mean, you've worked in an array of different mediums, lithographs, textiles, lino prints, painting, ceramics. But I guess the technique you're best known for, as we discussed in the intro, is collage. I mean, this podcast goes to a mixed audience, Mark. So for people who maybe don't know, can you tell us a little bit about the process of collage? How do you make a collage?
Well, you can start in so many ways, but I think basically it's about cutting something out and sticking it down. There's different types of collage. So I work in the sort of the French style called papier collé, which is where you're actually cutting bits of paper and applying it. I'm not a photo montage collagist who might sort of deal with found materials cut out, although every now and then I find a sort of photographic head of a human and slip it in just to be irreverent. But basically, my approach to collage, in a way, I suppose, it follows a historical strand from synthetic cubist collages of Picasso through people like John Piper and Julian Trevelyan. John Piper did an amazing set of collages in the 1930s that featured in an exhibition called Abstraction on the Beach in the early 2000s. And that, for me, was an absolute eye-opener of seeing certain sort of synthetic cubist approaches, reminding us that it's a flat surface and something stuck to it. And the use of bits of decorative paper, for example. So these end papers that I mentioned earlier, designed by Edward Bawden, were cropping up as clouds for John Piper. And that for me was so inspiring. So that was really how I began to learn about collage. But basically, the simplest form of collage could be the paper cut, where you literally cut a piece of paper into a silhouette, apply glue to the back and stick it down. And I'm hugely inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's paper cuts that are like proto Matisse. And if I'm ever feeling a little bit lackluster, I go straight to a book of his paper cuts and look at them, because he manages to have mystery, poetry, joy, darkness, boldness, exquisite fineness in his output. So he's very, very inspirational. That's at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is a much more mixed media approach, which is where you use paint, oil pastel, coloured crayon, dip pen, and you have all of these ingredients. And the kind of skill to the approach is basically having all of these disparate media and getting them to talk to each other. And often when you begin a collage, you have to fumble around for quite a long time. I use the analogy in my Raucous Invention book that it's a little bit like stepping onto a dance floor. You can hear a tune and you're desperate to cut some good moves. But basically, every move that you make feels like an inarticulate fumble.
Well, you talked about going through the pain barrier, Mark, when you're doing this in your book as well.
Yeah, and it is literally, you could give up and you think, none of this is working. Everything's fighting, but you've got to hold the faith and keep going. And suddenly, what happens is perhaps two bits of paper or a beautiful coloured bit of paper and a dip pen flourish. Suddenly there's a connection, or they speak to each other. And I find that when two or more elements begin to sort of spark off each other, then you get to a stage where all of the steps remaining seem to follow a predetermined course. But you have to sort of grapple until you get to that point. And I feel passionate to sort of share that, because so many artists are very unwilling to talk about their creative process. They don't want to give their secrets away. But I feel it can be really helpful to talk to people, to talk to the sort of an audience, a listening audience, that everybody goes through that, you know, when they're making images, and that the more you do, the more experienced you get at hitting those hiccups, and you just ride the storm and carry on. And I feel like anybody who is being creative and gets so far down the line should push through the pain barrier and keep going, and it will come right in the end.
You discovered collage, I think I'm right in saying, after leaving the Royal College of Art in the 90s.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did you have an epiphany? Can you remember the first time you employed collage in a piece of work?
Well, I do. And it was about around that time that I'd seen that John Piper exhibition. But what I found is, because I'm quite, I'm quite an exuberant person, I found when I used watercolor that I would be forever grappling to keep the tones modulated. And suddenly I cut a silhouette. I think it was of a Muscovy duck out, which was quite a graphic animal, black and white, and offered it up against a painted background. And I felt an absolute excitement about the tension between the cut edge and the expressive open mark making in the background. And it was a lightning flash moment. And then from there, the next major collage which is probably the collage that I would see as my sort of first grown-up collage, was part made from observation in front of some pigeon lofts in Whitby allotments, where I sat outside and looked at these huts painted in green and black and white, with the wonderful little sticks on top of the pigeon loft to stop the pigeons landing on top and to encourage them to land on the floor. The whole thing was almost like a piece of collage in its actuality. So I sat there and made that, and then imagined I'd have a little flock of small pigeons on the ground at home, that I would add those in at home. And sure enough, I came back and tried to add those, and I was really disappointed. I thought, this isn't very dynamic at all. And I thought, but what I was really excited about was the pigeon itself. So I just cut out a large pigeon and textured its wings, and then offered up this life-size pigeon perched on something imagined in the foreground. And suddenly the dynamism between that which was observed and that which was imagined came together. And that taught me the importance of invention in image making. And again, that was a moment where I never looked back, and I'm still proud of that collage that I made then. So those were two of my key learning moments with the media.
And at that stage, did you think, this is a new strand of my creative practice right here and now?
I think I did.
Yeah.
I think I felt like I'd found my voice.
Yeah.
I really just love the fact that you could literally pick up a little bit of wrapping or the inside of an envelope, open it out and cut a cloud out of it. And I enjoyed the fact that it's not about naturalism, but it's about essence. So you're finding a visual equivalent for something, and the playfulness, about spotting something that might spark an idea off. So I like the idea of using things that exist already, which is why I'm feeling slightly frustrated not to be talking to you in my own studio, because I'd almost like to be reaching out and finding a little fragment to talk about with great passion now, because it literally still does feel like that.
But then you'd move your head, Mark, and you'd be away from the microphone. This is something we want to avoid.
Oh, okay. I've got the cue. Keep my head still.
No. You're doing very well. It's excellent mic technique.
Excellent.
And you've even written a collage manifesto that appears in your book. Why did you feel the need to do that?
Well, that was a friend of mine who collaborated with me on some of the texts for my book, edited the Cambridge New Literary Journal. She's terribly highbrow. And she said, Mark, could you write me a collage? And I said, write me a manifesto. And I said, what could I possibly write a manifesto about? And she said, well, why don't you do it about collage? And I said, okay. And she said, in fact, why don't we just do it now? I'll record you. So then I began to think of my manifesto ideas for collage. And so it's actually quite a raw text. So perhaps if you flag any up, we could discuss them, and maybe I will.
Funny you say that, because there are a couple of elements I'm keen to talk about or was really intrigued by.
Excellent.
Well, some of it you've kind of touched on a little bit, but you say that collage is all to do with the edges. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that is a gift of a line, because I feel what collage can offer is the dynamic potential. It's about harnessing the dynamic potential of all its constituent parts. And those edges spark off each other. But also, if you use an edge well, it can also contain exuberance. So I was going to talk about something that I discovered, which is if you make open gestural random marks with a brush on a piece of paper, and then you turn that piece of paper over and draw a map of a cockerel or a bird in flight, and then you follow that with your scissors, and then you turn it over and you reveal these open gestural marks captured within the profile of the bird, the energy that's contained looks so intentional but unpre-rehearsed. And I feel the older I get, the more concerned I am about finding approaches to harness randomness within the creative process and to sort of riff off the life that brings to an image. So that is what I was going to say. It's about the relationship between the open mark and the containing hardness of the edge. It could be about the different kinds of edges for different things. So a torn edge for a cloud, a fine snipped edge for the fur of a creature, a beautiful geometric hard edge shape, to go to speak to something organic somewhere else in the image. So it's these wonderful edges. And also I found that sometimes an edge would break out of the picture plane. And when I first started making collages, I would very neatly trim them off and then have a little moment of regret and think, oh, it looks slightly less with that bit cut off. So then I realized that without doing it in a forced way, if something breaks the edges of the picture plane every now and then, that animates the stage. So I sometimes talk about the stage and a cast of characters when I'm doing workshops. And I think if one of the characters breaks the edge of the stage, it adds a kind of energy to the whole image, which is fun.
Your work is often set on edges where humans meet nature or meet creatures. And I'm wondering if there's a correlation between where you situate your work and the process, your fascination with edges in the process.
I don't know that is the case, but you're absolutely right that I love the edge of nature and man coming together. And I love it in a kind of workaday, disorderly, slightly ramshackle. Those spaces, such as allotments, feel like three-dimensional collages where they're almost put together by the makers. So therefore, they lend themselves very well to being interpreted by bits of paper. Also, my sort of heroes, Michael Rothenstein, John Piper, they all responded to the slightly forgotten workaday ramshackle places, as well as their more sublime views. And I really enjoy that. I think that's good. But yes, definitely, I think man and nature is good. It's something that excites.
I'm going to return to your manifesto for a moment.
Great,
which is
do it.
For number 8 on the manifesto,
okay.
You say we need to talk about material. Then, for number 9, you mentioned that you prefer the most paper-like paper, let's put it that way. You're not a huge fan of texture.
Not in collages. I think one could easily get carried away and start adding, everything, including the head of a goat a la Robert Rauschenberg. While I like that in his work, I feel what I'm doing, it's literally the tactile quality and the flatness of paper layered that really, really speaks to me. And I can feel that if it gets too thick, it becomes something else. Although now that I'm saying that, it's making me think, well, maybe I should challenge myself and make a slightly more relief collage with folds. I mean, I have thought about that actually, maybe to deal with some of the buildings or something, if I could actually use a little bit of relief with folds of paper. So never say never. But yes, I think what I was trying to convey in that is the excitement that I find in just papers of all types. I find them wonderful.
And you also add later that colour isn't relevant. But your work is full of colour, so I'm fascinated by that statement.
That I think I would like to edit in that, that I was saying that colour isn't fundamental to a manifesto about collage. I feel colour is fundamental to life. So that I feel, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I feel that's my weakest link in that manifesto, and I should have edited it out. Colour, in fact, and also since I wrote that, I feel even more evangelical about colour than I did then. But what I was really meaning was that in color, that it doesn't actually come in. It doesn't need to sit in a manifesto specifically about collage, but obviously it's central to my visual language. And actually, in my Raucous Invention book, moving on from that, I've actually got a whole section on color, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, well, you do. Can we talk about your background?
Yeah.
Because you grew up not far from where you live now in Yorkshire.
Yeah.
I know you're still close to your parents, but what did they do?
Well, my dad was an accountant.
Right.
My mum was mostly a stay-at-home mum. In fact, my dad actually still helps me with my accounts and invoicing and all of that kind of thing.
That's handy.
But they did really encourage me to make things. My mum, when I was a child, my mum definitely made it easy for us to have like craft tables. And she helped me facilitate ideas that I had of making things. And my dad definitely never said, "Oh, don't go to art school. You'll never make a living out of that."
Oh, that's interesting.
I was encouraged, and it was taken seriously. And basically, it was as good an option as doing anything else. And I'm super thankful for that from them. Your
creativity, was that encouraged at school?
It was encouraged. I had a really good art teacher at secondary school, Anne Finch. And I enjoyed my school. And then I had, I sort of found a visual mentor in my early 20s, a man called John Hutchinson, who's an architectural historian and an architect. And I say about him that he showed me a visual way of life. And it was interesting to meet a grown-up whose approach to visualness was very, very high on his list of importances. And that struck a chord with me because that's how I felt. But it was nice to have it legitimized.
And how did the pair of you meet?
In a little gallery in York, actually, where I just had a part-time job. And it was my introduction into York creative things. I mean, most of the people in it were from an older generation, but I had everything to gain from that because this man had Ruskin drawings, he had John Piper prints, he had Lucian Day fabrics, he had hand-blocked William Morris wallpaper, he had a collection of stained glass. In an ordinary house, his house wasn't a grand house, but his love and passion for the visual world and and work that was both fine art and design, historic and modern. All of those things taught me so, so much. And it was just an incredible eye-opener for me.
And this fascination with nature that, pervades your work.
Yeah.
When did that start? Was it innate? Were you always fascinated by nature? Yeah.
Absolutely. But again, mum and dad were amazing. Saturday afternoons, we would always tramp off to a sort of local woodland in the hope of seeing deer and never see any deer. But I absolutely loved birds and animals from childhood. I'd get bought books, Spotter's Guide books, and we'd go and stay in these Forestry Commission cabins on the North York Moors, again, in the hope of seeing nature. So right from the start, my two interests were animals, birds, and visual making things.
And I think I'm right in saying you have a sister.
I have a sister.
Is she the same? Was she creative and nature inspired or fascinated?
She is definitely creative. She works as a primary school teacher.
Right.
And she definitely enjoys being creative with younger. But I think she sometimes rolls her eyes at her big brother's eccentricities and can't quite understand the squalor that I can live in. Do you really need another one of those? And occasionally, when the house is getting out of hand, she'll help me with that in a very helpful way. But yeah,
we're going to talk about the house shortly. But I'm keen to know: were you always going to go to art school?
Always.
What age were you when you realised?
Somebody told me probably at the age of 7, oh, you're very good at drawing. And I got asked to do things. I did flirt with the idea of being a vet, but I wasn't academic or scientific enough for that. But yeah, really from the get-go, it was, I'd like to be an artist. And yeah.
You're very good at drawing, but you're also very good at writing. You've got beautiful handwriting. Was that something you practiced a lot as a child?
But I would say it isn't really writing, that's drawing.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
So I really admire the people who have a naturally fluent hand and can think and write simultaneously. Whereas for me, when I do my sort of copperplate handwriting, it's basically an exercise in drawing. So it can be quite hard to spell or remember to include certain words when I'm writing, because the brain that I'm engaging is more of a visual brain than a kind of intellectual, expressive brain, if that makes sense. But I absolutely do love graphic arts, and I love, for example, the linear qualities in somebody like Saul Steinberg. I feel a dip pen line is, wielding a dip pen is wielding a dip pen and a sharp pair of embroidery scissors are two of my favorite occupations. And I think if I was ever housebound, if I had a dip pen and a pair of scissors and some bits of paper and a bit of Indian ink, I'd be really happy.
You went to Glasgow School of Art to study illustration.
Yes.
You were taught by Mick Manning. Now, you described him in a talk with the Scottish Gallery a few years ago as being a tough taskmaster. I'm wondering in what way?
Well, Mick probably will be listening to this. He was idealistic in a gruff northern way.
Right.
He had all the right values, which would be that I should at all costs try to draw from life. So I kind of, as an impressionable 20-something-year-old, I would take that to heart and feel like, oh gosh, if I'm not drawing from life, I'm not doing it properly. And I feel, yeah, he was just a strong and idealistic force. And I admired his work too, so I wanted to impress him. But I think he actually looked up to me. Well, or not looked up to me, but he probably did rate me, but I was never quite sure because he didn't sort of quite let that show when he was a teacher. But we're friends nowadays and we talk about lurchers. And he has my wallpaper on his wall. So I think I've passed.
That's definitely a recommendation, isn't it? Yeah.
I do really admire him. And I remember him showing me a charcoal drawing of a dead otter that he'd found on the road, which was one of the most touching images. And it was made with such a kind of compassion and love for this creature that died. that it always stuck with me. So yeah, I really took from him his connection with nature and how he could enjoy the character in an animal, and that would always come over in his work.
Yeah. And then the Royal College of Art to study natural history illustration. Was that always part of the plan to go there?
Well, again, I was sort of part of a lineage in that Mick had been there and studied under John Norris Wood. So it felt like such a natural progression for me. And it was even more of a natural progression because I was so interested in modern British art. And John Norris Wood, had grown up working in Edward Bawden's studio. He'd been to Cedric Morris's Benton End drawing school. I don't know, he'd been friends with John Minton and had wonderful anecdotes about Minton. He was friends with Betty Swanwick. So I felt it was such a privilege to have his first-hand knowledge of these people. And at that moment at the Royal College, I was just so hungry for all of those references. And I was scrabbling around looking at every book, I was, and, holding up Minton's Time Was Away and looking at the dust jacket as though it was some kind of supernatural thing. It was a really important moment because for my art historical development, and amazing to be in this modern British lineage, really. And I think I made the most of that aspect of being at the Royal College.
What did your work look like at this stage? Was it recognisable? Would you look at your work back then and recognise the same artist today?
Yes, but I feel like I had imposter syndrome. I was trying lots of things out and not feeling like anything was quite coming together. And though I loved being at the college and I felt like in a way the sort of talent and the sort of pressure that comes with being somewhere like the Royal College doesn't necessarily make your best work. But there were no regrets. And I feel like I was really, really supported there. I had fantastic tutorials by somebody called Anne Howson, who talked to me about thumbnail sketches and just doing like a postage stamped compositional study. And she would also bring me like Kathleen Raine pamphlets on British Romanticism to read. And we'd talk about Peter Warlock's Capriole Suite and Samuel Palmer and the psychological content in Balter's paintings. So I found her tutorials absolutely wonderful. She was, again, quite tough in certain, she'd tell you when you were making a hackneyed piece of work, but I found there was a great generosity and a great informed cultural sensibility that I absolutely fed off. And that was a real privilege to work with her.
So it's the 90s. The young British artists, the YBAs, are in their kind of imperial, Saatchi-fueled pomp. And here you are talking about John Minton and Peggy Angus and people like that. Did you feel you were swimming against the tide, that people were more interested in ideas and concepts than making at that time?
I think I did. And I remember Dan Fern, who was the head of the course, getting me in to this seminar where it was discussed whether drawing was relevant.
Wow.
At art school.
Interesting.
And I felt I took it, I actually made a good case for it, but I took it too personally. And actually I probably did him a disservice because I now really realize that of course he knew it was relevant, but he was just posing the question.
He was just pushing you.
He was pushing us. And I now look at the work that he makes. We're Instagram pals, and his abstract collages speak to me very much. And I realized what a good head of course he actually was. And it was very sort of avant-garde, and there were all things happening, but it was rather cool. I feel it was typified by girls' outfits in that they all wore sort of charcoal dresses with Velcro up the front with a sort of colourful trainer, but everything was rather sober and noughties. There wasn't much decoration. And I think post that period, I feel like decoration has been embraced much more. So I feel like I was at the Royal College in a particular rather cool navel gazing moment that didn't necessarily suit me well. But I knew that I would come out the other side, and so would visual culture.
So you were always confident that your work would find an audience?
I wasn't necessarily always confident, but my interest was genuine. My enthusiasm was genuine. So I just felt like I would hang in there. You know, all you can be is personally authentic. And I felt a confidence that if I pursued my own strand of inquiry, there would be a way of making that work. The things that I were looking at were inherently interesting. That doesn't mean to say that I didn't find YBA work interesting as well, but it was more in an academic way. It didn't necessarily speak to me visually, but I found its existence exciting and invigorating and shocking. I had my enthusiasms developed, and I just went with what I really was passionate about.
You've been quite vocal about the importance of making to creativity rather than ideas, that you can create without necessarily having an initial idea.
I feel like sometimes at art school, the need for a concept from the offset can be stultifying for anybody, even somebody that's trying to make ideas-based work. And I've always found that basically action is a great way of finding an idea. And even just lining up a row of 3 postcards that turn you on is a starting point. I feel that ideas come at the pit face. And my advice to anybody who was struggling is move your hands, do something, because I feel I've seen so many art students get lost because they haven't got this kind of cast iron idea. And I think if you fumble around and make a heap of things, somewhere along the way, the idea will come. So I feel like, and I feel also that maybe in making culture, everything has to be legitimized by a concept because it's more quantifiable than actually intuitively being able to read and appreciate something for its aesthetic strength. I feel like we're in an age where everything has to be quantifiable and assessed. And I think in a way, the cast iron written down art blurb or art explanation is a way of legitimizing the importance of a piece of work. Whereas I actually prefer the image or the piece of work being able to speak for itself. I feel like the more you have to read in a gallery, the less interesting the exhibition is. The work in all mediums that really speaks to me is the work that just arrests you and you get a gut response to it. And that might be a Phila de Barlow exhibition in a Venice Biennale, or it might be a Ruskin watercolor. But I feel like the work that leaves me cold, or the curation that leaves me cold, is where there's just too much art speak that actually tells you how to think and doesn't give you space to actually respond intuitively to the work in front of you.
That's really interesting, because I was going to ask whether you thought there was an element of nostalgia in your work, or at least a desire to hark back to a simpler time.
Ooh, good question. I think the answer is yes, in one way, but I'm mindful of that, and I don't want to be just an anachronistic person. I think we can take certain aspects from looking back, i.e., I don't know, if I listen to 90s music or 80s music, I enjoy the innocence of that synth sound, and I feel that sounds fresh today. And in a way, there's a similar analogy with work, that maybe you could take an approach to work from a time past that has a freshness and life of its own and do something with it. But what I don't want to do is emulate work from the past and make work seem like it's a pastiche of the past. But I feel that there is something to be taken from the rawness of work before there was so much technology. So that's half an answer to that. Yeah. But I also want to challenge myself, having turned 50, maybe to look forward and be a bit daring. And if I get the opportunity to do something totally out of my comfort zone and technological or forward looking, go for it. You know, I wouldn't want to pigeonhole myself.
You'll have to own a computer first, Mark, for that to happen, I reckon.
Yes. Or collaborate with an absolute whiz on the computer.
Indeed. I mean, we are coming to the end of our time, but I can't leave without talking about your collecting habit.
Okay.
Your house has featured in the world of interiors and the lifestyle sections of national newspapers. You've described collecting as an act of creativity. How is it creative?
Well, in the latest iteration of Raucous Invention, I've done a whole chapter about the car boot sale as a kind of creative inspiration. And I feel that to design objects, you have to be discerning and visually discriminating. And I feel like owning objects is one of the ways of doing that. You don't have to. Olive Cook, who contributed to the Saturday books, talked about having a kind of a notional museum where you could actually look at your favorite painting in the National Gallery and retain that for yourself. But you could also have a collection of matchboxes or pebbles picked up from the beach. And I like that idea. But I feel that really to make objects, good objects, you need to know what a good object is for you. And I think having a relationship with them and surrounding yourself with visual objects is part of that. So I kind of also think about looking at car boot sales. I've used this analogy of it being like a sort of ethnography of the everyday that's sort of set up by 9 in the morning and put away by 12 o'clock. It's like a sort of ephemeral pit rivers of our museum of our time. And basically, it's a place where you can learn about what is good. So I also feel that my house is a 3-dimensional collage, and the similar rules that apply in paper apply with objects. Certain pieces in the house are placed with forensic precision, and other pieces sort of jostle in and fill in the gaps. And I feel that creates an energy in the display as well. So I feel like my relationship to objects is similar to my collage making mentality, in that it's to do with bringing disparate things together and enjoying the energy that happens when maybe slightly surprising things rub shoulders with each other.
So there's a relationship between the two, which is
definitely
kind of interesting. Is there a line between collecting and hoarding? And do you recognize where that line is?
You mischievous man. Of course I do. And actually, I think at this moment I could do with going through my house and just throwing away cardboard boxes and bits of junk that have accumulated. But I don't think I'm a hoarder, in that I'm not somebody who just keeps random things for the sake of it. I'm not necessarily the most orderly person. So every now and then I have to take myself in hand and give my living accommodation a good mucking out. And I can do that ruthlessly. I'm not somebody that hangs on to sort of bits of paper for the sake of it. All the objects that I have, I've chosen. And if you picked something up, it would have a story and it would have a reason for being in my life. And, you know, when we do the next podcast, Grant, we can do a around the house tour of objects, and I can talk you through their particular resonance and importance.
Well, I'd very much like that.
I think there's a cautionary tale there. You know, I don't want to slip into being a hoarder. And I think also everybody reaches simplicity in the end. So I think at some point I could imagine giving away choice things to people that matter and evangelizing about that which I care about in that way. So I'm not so attached to things that I couldn't imagine a life beyond a really dense house full of collections.
Interesting. So we're at that point of the interview where I ask about future projects. You've got the show happening at the Scottish Gallery of your tapestries. When is that happening?
That's happening in, I think, November 2025.
Way off, right. Okay.
Way off.
Yeah.
Before then, I'm going to be working, I think, for a Japanese company called Arts and Science with the fashion designer Marco Zanini on a paper cut textile for his next autumn and winter collection. And I'm also going to do a paper cut textile for St. Jude's to celebrate their 20th anniversary next year. And I'm having a show, various shows this Christmas, including the Godfrey and What Christmas show. And I'm trying to think what else.
Well, you have the updated version of the book, Raucous Invention, The Joy of Making, being published. Yes. Do you know when that is being published next year?
Yes, I think that's going to be published in May. And for anybody that's got one already, this one's 60 pages longer. And there's all kinds of digressions about colour and car booting and tapestries and even more about collaboration in it. So I'm really pleased. In fact, I collaborated with my nephew on the text. So I spoke and he took down my text. So that was quite fun. So
very good.
I'm even collaborating within the family now.
Yeah. And are you a raucous person?
Well, here's a thing. I think I'm very aware that skill can be a kind of gilded cage. You don't want to become so skillful that inhibits you from breaking your own rules. The only rule is there are no rules. And what I like about the word raucous is I think of a sort of a rookery of cawing, exuberant creatures. But I feel like the inherent act of creativity shouldn't be polite. I think Picasso, who's a contentious figure in many ways, what I rate about him was his capacity to be raucous and to go beyond that which was finessed and academic and brilliant. And I feel like at those moments of boldly going forward, not knowing where it's going to take you, with a sort of braveness, you can find something exciting and new. And so that's really what it's about. The idea of raucous is about not feeling that the creative act has to be polite. You don't need to have a full moon and all your paints lined up in a row and be in love and have the perfect dream studio. You just need to have conviction and move your hands and go for it, really. That's what I feel that I would want to say to anyone, an art student, a primary school kid, somebody retired who wants to get back into making things. Be bold and go for it.
Well, I think that's a lovely place to finish, Mark. I look forward to many years of your impolite creativity. Thank you so much for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Cheers. Thanks. That was really good. Great.
You can find out more about Mark at his Instagram account, which is @Mark_Hearld. That's @Mark_Hearld. As ever, to find other podcasts that I've done and to sign up to our newsletter, go to materialmatters.design. And there are images related to the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. Incidentally, you can now also find the show on YouTube Music, as well as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a host of other places. There's absolutely no excuse not to listen. And it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £2.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.